$7 million penalties for employer inspections in the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, new discussion and opposition to Bill C2, updates on federal court cases on the SUV program and artificial transactions, and a new program in Manitoba on the Start-Up Visa program provincially on this episode of ImmPulse.
I'm Howard Greenberg.
Hi, I'm Hameed.
Well, what's on your mind today? Pick your poison. Which one do you like?
Well, it's a full summary of different issues to consider. What took my notice was the high level of penalties that were issued to employers in Canada in the first, 3 quarters of the year. I think they're looking at $7 million of penalties have been awarded against employers who've hired temporary foreign workers, primarily on LMIAs, and that's up by about 50% in comparison to previous penalties. But we also see that there's about 40 or 50% less LMIAs this year. So what do you make of that?
They're looking more closely.
Much more closely. If you look at that ratio, typically we saw inspections are random, right? You get 1/3 that are random. It could be, for example, you didn't pass a previous inspection,
right?
You've been flagged, or whistleblower, right?
Hotline.
And we know right now in the economy, there's a lot of concern about unemployment, pressure to reduce the number of foreign workers. Although we're talking about LMIAs, we know that they could potentially reduce that number even more. So I'm not only thinking this applies for LMIAs, but what about for IMPs and if you're on ICTs or any trade agreement work permits as an employer?
They're looking more closely.
Right.
What I find particularly interesting about the H-1B announcements that have recently been proclaimed by the U.S. government, by President Trump, is that Canada sees it as an opportunity. And they talk about it in terms of a new program, which has not yet been announced, but presumably is going to create some kind of pathway, which presents all sorts of challenges, but we'll have to wait and see. In our last broadcast, we talked about nearshoring, and I think that's an important point. It's a North American market now. It's not a Canadian market or a U.S. market. Customers are in the United States and in Canada, and they're going to be serviced by software developed by high-tech individuals in Canada. And this really grows an opportunity for Canada to develop expertise. And this is not necessarily a part of what Prime Minister Carney's talking about, but the ramifications of being able to transfer key individuals to Canada from an existing workforce outside of Canada is a wonderful opportunity to fill the gap for the North American market.
Right. So you're speaking of a corporate strategy that could be very effective.
Absolutely.
There's also another angle, which is interesting. Canada's always suffered from the perspective that some of our best talent graduates and then gets pulled into the Silicon Valley or to the US market. This is one of the rare instances where Canada could hit back, and that's what the discussions are talking about. There could be amazing talent, foreign nationals, for example, that may consider building their new business in Canada and getting the benefits of that and headquartering the company in Canada. There's a lot of discussion in Waterloo about a concept called Build Canada, that this is the time to double down and try to encourage incentives to bring the right talent in. What I'm hoping is that often where talent gets discouraged is where there's no pathway for them to predictably get a PR, opportunity to land. I'm hoping that this solution is not only a temporary work permit, but some way for them to stay within a reasonable processing time.
I can't help but recall a recent discussion of someone we were speaking with, in which we were told about a Canadian having trouble entering the United States to continue with employment on a CUSMA visa.
Right.
And so much to the point where the American employer, which has a number of Canadian employees, they're thinking to themselves, maybe we should have a substantial presence in Canada. We can't afford the uncertainty of the back and forth.
Right. So ideally, the smart immigration policy might stimulate economic activity and investment, which is exactly what we need during this trade negotiation that we're having with the U.S.
So setting up in Canada is not just about a simple setup. It's a lot of careful steps to make sure you dotted your I's and crossed your T's.
Right.
Okay.
Speaking about dotting I's and crossing T's, when we look at some of the recent information on Bill C2, Strong Borders Act, there's some important details. I think you had a comment or two on updates.
Well, there's been some testimony before the Standing Committee on Immigration in the last days of September. It was primarily with respect to the study permits and the student program. But embedded in that discussion was a discussion about C2. Under C2, there is a power to suspend large groups of people, categories of people. And that's caused a lot of consternation in the Canadian bar as to how that could be applied. But we've seen recently in a presentation before the Standing Committee in the latter days of September that senior officials are discussing the application of C2 in a very restrictive way to address fraud, to address integrity and large-scale misuse of the immigration system, and not necessarily to call a backlog. So the jury's still out on what the possibilities are and who could be impacted. But we know that many people we've been speaking to who have been in the system a long time are starting to feel nervous that they might be refused after waiting for years in a queue.
Now, politically, when we look at what's happened so far, it seems like there's strong opposition to this bill, both from the minority governments and from other segments where they feel the civil liberties impact is too severe, and they're asking for significant revisions or a new bill before they sign off. So it seems like there's still a ways to go.
The new bill is coming. I'm not sure it's going to touch this issue of revoking classes of applicants, but certainly this issue of who C2 applies to is still remains to be determined.
Right. Maybe that's a good segue. We're talking about classes that are very popular. There's a federal court case on an SUV application where there was a concern about an artificial transaction, and that was challenged at the federal court. And interestingly, this issue of what is an artificial transaction came up, and the applicant was making the argument that the officer didn't refuse and clearly explain what was the concern with regard to the specific business. But ultimately, it was found that there was a lack of business activities. When asked for evidence of what had happened, the individual applicant was unable to demonstrate that the business plan's objectives were met. Lack of activities resulted in the ultimate refusal, and the court said that that seems to be a reasonable proposition. If you haven't taken enough actions, it's inconsistent with your business plan, then it's reasonable for an officer to declare that that's an artificial transaction.
What's the moral of the story? Never assume that you've done enough?
Never assume that you've done enough, and know that your submission, your business plan, the commitment certificate, all the undertakings you've made about the business will be measured by your actual activities. And now we see precedent that if you've not done enough, that can be deemed an artificial transaction.
In baseball lingo, you've probably only gone to first or second base.
Right.
But having a great business plan and being able to demonstrate benefits to Canada through the plan is not going to be enough.
Correct. And as we've mentioned, we know the refusal rates are up to 80% in the first quarter.
Right.
If you're concerned that you haven't done enough, get an opinion. Speak to a lawyer. Make sure you understand what your obligations are. And the benefit is you have time to update until a decision is made.
You can never do enough.
Right. And let me give one update. As a proud person from Manitoba, I do see that the Manitoba provincial government may be taking a very bold move and creating their own provincial Start-Up Visa program. And when you read up about the development of this discussion with the province, it appears that they've taken lessons from what has worked and hasn't worked from the federal Start-Up Visa program. And they're going to have their own program that encourages tech companies doing innovation in agriculture, things that matter to Manitoba, to encourage investment and driving new business entrepreneurship for self-employed people. So that should be an interesting development.
And this is only the beginning. The other provinces will follow suit.
Hopefully. We need a little bit more variety in our business programs. If you're interested in business immigration or any of the changes to Canadian immigration programs or H-1B issues, please feel free to reach out to Greenberg Hameed at greenberghameed.com.
And if you think I should be wearing my hair any differently than I am now, please send me a personal email message. Mark in the reline, hair redesign. In our last broadcast, we talked about onshoring.
Nearshoring?
Yes, it.
Okay.
I knew it was near water. I'm interested in discussing today is L1Bs. It's in the newspaper every day.
Do you mean H-1Bs?
That too.
Details. It's just letters, right?
Yeah, right.